Hello, I'm Colin, and welcome to a very special episode of the C&C Talks podcast. This episode will not have the usual format our episodes have, but we will have a usual episode coming out later this week on Friday, November 24th, at the usual time, 8 a.m. Pacific Time. But on this episode, Charlie and I will be joined by a guest, Dane Gonzalez of Locked On Mariners, Seattle Overload, and Control the Zone to talk about the Mariners offseason. We get into what went wrong for the Mariners last year, the disastrous end-of-season press conference, the move the front office has already made, what additions they should make to remain competitive this offseason, whether ownership will allow those moves to happen, and what the division looks like heading into 2024. Without further ado, let's get into our interview with Dane Gonzalez. We are now thrilled to be joined by Dane Gonzalez. He's a co-host of the Locked On Mariners podcast and the Seattle Overload podcast, available wherever you listen to podcasts, as well as the Control the Zone podcast, available on Patreon. Ty, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the invite. I've been going on a couple shows lately, but I love talking ball, man. It's the off season. There's nothing really else to do right now than talk ball. So excited to hear what you guys want to talk about.
Yeah, so we'll obviously go into what moves a bit later on, what moves the Mariners should make this offseason. But I do kind of want to look back at the 2023 season for a second. Because obviously, there are a lot of expectations coming into the season for the Mariners. They've just won 90 games on back-to-back seasons. Having just ended their playoff drought in 2022, there were thoughts that maybe they could make a run at the American League West. But they ended up missing the playoffs entirely. So what went wrong exactly? Was this just a problem of the front office not making the moves they needed to make, or did the team just not perform to the level they were expected to?
Yeah, I think the roster build was certainly incomplete. I was pretty firm, even as someone that has mostly been a Dipoto regime defender, or at least I've tried to give the front office a bit more of the benefit of the doubt than most within the community. I felt that they were at least one bat short. On top of that, I mean, some of the moves, I know everyone, looks back on like the Colton Wong acquisition and the AJ Pollock acquisition as if those were slam dunks to be bad moves when they were made. I don't think that's the case. I just think that they didn't, wind up panning out really. Like Colton Wong was coming off of a great season offensively, a career year offensively for him, and then all of a sudden, it wasn't even like he dove 20 to 25% under what he was in 2022. He was literally 100% worse than he was in 2022, and that's just some stuff that you really can't foresee. And so that's a big part of it, right? Two of their biggest offseason acquisitions didn't pan out. Teoscar Hernandez didn't really pan out the way that they were hoping he would. He was still a league average bat and had a couple months where he got hot, but that didn't work out at all like they were hoping. And obviously, Robbie Ray got hurt very early on in the first game, and he was going to be a big part of that rotation. And I think we saw the effects of having, as a result of not just Ray's injury, but Gonzalez's injury and Hancock's injury and Chris Flexen not panning out, that, two young guys in the rotation was they were going to wear down eventually once you got towards the end there. And you saw that with Wu, and you saw that with Miller to a certain degree as well. And then the bullpen kind of collapsed because, they traded Paul Sewald. And the problem wasn't really that they traded Paul Sewald. It was that they didn't go out and get themselves another reliever to help offset the loss of Sewald. And I'm talking about like an actual established high leverage reliever, not, a guy that you're hoping might be something for you like Edward Bizzardo, who they did get, or Trent Thornton, who they got around the same time. So, it's a culmination of a bunch of things. It's the variance of baseball, right? It's kind of what Jerry was talking about with the whole 54% comment, is like you're trying to account for variance, and there's just some things that are going to happen over the course of the season that just, it's not expected, right? Whether it's a big time injury early on in the year, or it's a player like Colton Wong not panning out at an aggressive degree. So yeah, it's a bunch of things. And also, strikeouts were a major problem for this team, particularly in key situations. And, you had a bunch of strikeout heavy hitters stacked up against one another in the same lineup. So it's Teo, it's Cal, it's Gino, and so when you get into those stretches of the lineup, particularly in key situations, we saw what the result was. So yeah, it's a bunch of things. So this offseason they really need to look to kind of balance out their lineup and hopefully cover their bases a bit more in case certain things go wrong.
Yeah, thanks for that, Charlie.
Yeah. One of the questions I had was concerning the end of the year press conference with Dipoto, Hollander, and Service. That's the one where Dipoto said that the goal was to win 54% of the games. That obviously did not look good for the front office, but considering what happened in the playoffs with both the Diamondbacks and the Rangers going to the World Series, what are your thoughts on that conference and Services and Dipoto's comments?
Yeah, I thought they were. I mean, if you're familiar, with our show, if you watched our show, you'll know that I thought those comments were very, very tone deaf on Jerry's part. I do understand to a certain degree of what he was saying, but that's mostly because I'm a nerd when it comes to this stuff. Like I like roster building, I like baseball theory and all that stuff. But for the most part, for most fans, they don't want to hear about that. And the problem with Jerry and being so open and transparent during his time in Seattle is that he'll just get on a roll when he starts talking about things. And he starts talking about things that really no one should care about, frankly. And especially with the way that the season ended for the Mariners after the great month of August and then how disappointing September was, nobody wanted to hear that. The only thing people wanted to hear was, how are you going to fix this? How are you going to make it so we do win the division? How are you going to make it so we win those couple of extra games that we needed in September? How are we going to overcome the Rangers and the Astros, who are now, not at the time, but now we have the context of them being the, back-to-back World Series winners. How are you going to get this team to a World Series? That's what fans wanted to hear, and that's not at all what he gave them. The 54% comment in particular is flawed in the way that he worded it, because he spoke specifically in absolutes with the 54%. He said verbatim, the teams that win 54% of the time over the last decade have always made the playoffs. Well, that's not true. The Cardinals haven't made the playoffs sometimes. The Yankees haven't made the playoffs sometimes. And there's only a few teams that have actually won 54% over the last decade, but they haven't made the playoffs every single time, like Jerry worded it. And if you're just talking about a single season as well, from that perspective, the Mariners just won 54% and they didn't make it. So do you see, kind of the flaw in the way that he worded it there? But yeah, the 54% thing at the end of the day is fine, right? That's what you should actually, as fans, we should all want to hear that, because he's not saying like we only want to win 54% of the time. 54% is a good mark to aim for, where you can account for the variance of baseball, like I talked about, answering your first question. So, and he says this during the press conference, sometimes you'll win 58 and 60%, sometimes you're going to win 52, 50%, but you need to be at least good enough to win 54% of the time. Like that's like, you have to be at least that good. So, yeah, so I think that at the end of the day is fine, but the forum that he used to say that and the way in which he worded it is just it wasn't the move really on Dipoto's part. And also I think it's I like Jerry is deserving of all the criticism for what he said, especially for we're asking the fans or we're doing them a favor and all this stuff. Like that's just really, really silly. But also John Stanton, the owner of the team, should be up there taking some of the questions. At least he should be taking some of the heat, and he was there. Jake Garcia of King 5 Sports said John Stanton was there during the press conference. He was just behind the cameras, so he should have been up there taking some of the questions as well. But it was just a bad look all around for the Mariners. So
yeah, I 100% agree with that. So then with what you said about Stanton, though, do you believe that he will actually open up the checkbook this offseason? Like, do you actually have confidence that he'll do at least partially what it takes to meaningfully improve this team?
No, because he hasn't really given us a reason to think otherwise, right? So until he gives us a reason to think otherwise, I'm probably going to be pretty firm on no. At least to like, I think he'll spend some. I think the Mariners do have money to work with to a certain degree. That Jerry and Justin do have money to work with. It's really that they just don't want to give out like the 10-year deal. They don't want to be on the hook for 25 to 30 to 40 million dollars a year. 8, 9, 10 years down the road. Like they want to try and avoid that. I mean, it's one of the reasons that they didn't get Marcus Semien. They didn't want to go to the 8 years on Semien. So because like right now, like there was the Daniel Kramer article, right? Did you guys see that with Ohtani basically saying like, oh, the Mariners don't really see Ohtani as a part of their realistic agenda for the offseason, right?
Yeah.
Ryan Divish went on Ben Ranieri's podcast, Sea Level Podcast, that like about 2 hours after Kramer posted that article, and Ben asked him about it. And Divish is, and I'm not saying that Kramer's not in tune with anyone. Like I'm sure he's talking to people within the organization and all that. I'm not saying anything about Kramer's reporting, but Divish is also very, very, very in tune, and he told Ben on that show that he thinks the Mariners are actually comfortable offering Shohei like $55 to $60 million a year. It's just they don't want to get to a point where it's like 10 years into the contract and they're still paying him as a two-way player, where you're still paying him $60 million when it's clear as day. No matter who he plays for, no matter who he signs with, the contract is going to be reflective of the reality that he's not going to want to pitch at some point, like if he's going to have to pick one or the other, it's probably like he's going to pick hitting, because it's far easier to hit at a high level later on in your playing career than it is pitching. So I think that's just a prime example of kind of what the whole like philosophy has been in terms of like the big free agent pools, and why they haven't really dove into those free agent pools over the last few years, is that they don't want to, because I mean, look at the shortstop market, right? Trey Turner signed for what, 12 years? Xander Bogaerts signed for like 13 years. Like all these deals were, insane double-digit year contracts. And I don't think I think that's what the hangup is. Now we can have an actual debate about whether or not, you should just bite the bullet at some point if the player is worth it. But I don't necessarily think that money is the main issue here. I think there's definitely a certain limit to what Stanton and is giving Dipoto and Hollander, but yeah, I also like, again, I need to see it before I say like I have any sort of confidence, because like I mean, they spent money on Robbie Ray, but that's not an insane contract. It was $23 million a year, and then they paid Julio, but Julio is going to be a steal as long as he keeps on playing at the level that he's playing at, or even like 75% of the level that he's been playing at. Like that's going to be a steal of a contract. Luis Castillo deal is fine. It's not like a superstar contract either. So they haven't really given out that major contract. So I'm not sure if I have faith in that. I do think that they'll spend some this offseason, but my expectations are more like Lourdes Gurriel Jr. or, Jameer Candelario, for example, like just to throw out a couple names there. That's kind of the tier of player that I more think the Mariners are going to be looking at, and I think the trade market is still going to be a high volume area for them this winter.
Yep. You're listening to C&C Talks. We're here with Dane Gonzalez of Locked On Mariners, Seattle Overload, and Control the Zone. Ty, the Mariners they've already made a few moves this offseason. They've traded Isaiah Campbell to the Red Sox for infielder Luis Urias. Also made trades for catcher Blake Hunt and relievers Cody Bolton and Caleb Ort. What should we know about these new additions that the Mariners have already made?
Yeah, not to be too mean about it, but Cody Bolton and Caleb Ort, they're mostly bullpen fodder. They're 40-man fodder. I don't think that Caleb Ort will even survive the winter, just the natural 40-man roster crunch of the winter. Maybe Bolton. The thing that we always have to take into account here with the Dipoto regime is like even the biggest Dipoto regime detractors have to admit, like, they're really good at identifying relievers and getting the most out of relievers. So, hey, maybe there's something that they see in Cody Bolton that they think they can get more out of, and they're going to turn him into a pretty big piece of this bullpen. Because I mean, we made that joke with Gabe Spire last year, and Gabe Spire is now an important part of this bullpen. So, yeah, so like those two guys wouldn't think too much of. I mean, keep an eye on Bolton, but for the sake of he's a Mariners reliever, he's a young reliever the Mariners have identified. Blake Hunt is interesting. Some interesting catching depth. I don't think it precludes the Mariners from re-signing Tom Murphy or doing anything else at the catcher position behind Cal Raleigh. I think they do. I think their priority there is for sure Murphy. But Hunt is the guy that can hit for some power. He's a decent enough defender. Like, he's a solid third catcher to have. He's definitely an improvement over Brian O'Keefe and some of the other guys that they've kind of rotated through that third catcher spot as of late. So yeah, I like taking the shot there on Hunt, and I like the aggressiveness in terms of trying to take advantage of the Rays 40-man roster crunch, which they seem to have every single year, where they're always trading off guys off of their 40-man roster. It's nice to be a part of that for once, because the Mariners haven't really done that in years past, and I've wanted them to, with guys like Jake Cronenworth and Brent Honeywell. Honeywell didn't really work out, but Cronenworth did. So you never know. You never know. So Blake Hunt could be a solid addition as well. Luis Urias is really interesting. He was worth 2 Fangraphs wins above replacement. So he was an everyday player, essentially. Like, when you cross that 2 F4 threshold, you're considered to be an everyday player, and he was that for 2 years, and he was hitting with plus power at second base, which is obviously not a position that you get a lot of power output from. So that's the upside of that is really interesting. And he was injured a lot last year, or this past year, 2023. He had a head injury during spring training. Then he had a hamstring injury that put him on the 60-day IL for like 3 months. And then he finished the year on the IL as well. So I look at 2023, and I know people go like, oh, well, he was really bad. And yeah, he was, but rhythm is a big factor for guys. Like, think about like Malik Smith a few years ago. He missed all of spring training, and it completely derailed his season and arguably his career. Dylan Moore missed all of spring training this year, and he looked lost at the plate for a while. He was able to produce a little bit there for a couple weeks stretch, but for the most part, he looked lost. Time, reps, game reps, all these things are very, very important. And so I think that's kind of what Urias endured this past year. And I think there's no reason to think that as long as he stays healthy, he can get back to being that 2+ win guy that he was in Milwaukee, who's, hitting for, 240-ish, 250 average and slugging, 20 to 25 bombs. I think he's more than capable of doing that if he's healthy. And plus, like, we're talking about a 26-year-old. We're not talking about a 31, 32, 33-year-old who's towards the tail end of his career, and there's other physical signs of decline. So I'm really intrigued by that move. Right now it kind of looks like the plan at second base, or maybe third base if they trade Gino Suarez, would be to platoon Urias and Rojas, which I don't think fans are going to love. I think it depends obviously on what the rest of the roster looks like once we get to opening day. But I think it's interesting. The splits certainly line up in that regard, and I think Urias is one of those guys that we can look back on in July and go, wow, I can't believe they got him for Isaiah Campbell. Because like, what did we just talk about with the relievers, right? Mariners are great at identifying relievers, particularly mid-leverage relievers, and that's what Isaiah Campbell is. He had a nice year, don't get me wrong, and I like Isaiah Campbell a lot. I was very high on Campbell before the season. I said a couple of times on my show that I thought he was going to wind up being a pretty decent part of the bullpen by year's end, and sure enough. and but he's a mid-leverage reliever at the end of the day. Like, and the Mariners have been able to just pump those guys out with ease over the last 8 years or so. So I'm not too concerned about the loss of Campbell. I think it's an interesting shot to take on Urias. I'm excited to see what they do with him.
And that actually leads me into the next question, which is looking forward to the rest of free agency and into next season. What are some areas that the Mariners should target? Obviously, there's that big hole at second base right now that Arias could possibly fill. But who are some names that you think could fit in well on this team?
Yeah, with regards to second, I don't know how much sense it makes at this point. But they're just like the free agent market is so bad this year in terms of position players. It's really, really bad. But if they end up moving Gino or maybe they trade Dylan Moore or something like that, Whit Merrifield could make some sense there at second base. That's a guy that the Mariners have had interest in the past. He can play some corner outfield along with second base. He still can steal a ton of bags. He doesn't hit the ball hard at all. He was like first percentile in hard hit rate this year. It's awful. And the Mariners obviously, value hard hit rates and stuff like that. So I don't know if there's much of an interest there. But the thing that we know about Jerry and company is that they love to circle back on guys that we've heard they've been interested in the past. Colton Wong is a prime example of that. So maybe that's someone. Brandon Belt, because like the big story right now, at least it seems from the indication that I get from our listeners, is like what's going on with Ty France, and like should Ty France be a part of this thing, and should they run it back with France for another year? If I think they are going to run it back with France, but they need to do it with some protection. So Brandon Belt, if he doesn't retire, would be pretty interesting. Apparently they were close-ish on him this past offseason before he wound up ultimately going to the Blue Jays. And he had a good year. I don't see any reason why he should retire other than like if he's just out of love with the game or just, doesn't want to put his body through that anymore. Doesn't want to go through the, this 8+ months of the season. I mean, it's a long season, but he's still more than capable of producing at a high level. So I'm intrigued by Brandon Belt. And then, on the high end, like, look, all right, if Divish is right and they're willing to give 55 to 60 million a year to Ohtani just on a shorter term deal, they should be interested in giving Cody Bellinger a lot of money. And I think Bellinger is an amazing fit for the T-Mobile Park with that left-handed swing. I think he would be incredible in Seattle, quite frankly. I think we could see like the return of like MVP Cody Bellinger in Seattle, frankly. I just don't know if that's actually going to happen. I don't know if they're actually going to go after him. The thing for me, right, is like the pitching. Because it makes the most sense for me on the outside looking in. Like you need bats, but that's an inefficient part of the market, free agent market this year. So use your young starting pitching, Miller or Wu, to go get the bat or bats that you need, and then go sign a pitcher. And I think they have a lot of interest in Yoshinobu Yamamoto. It's just no one really knows what Yamamoto wants. There's reports that he only wants to play on the East Coast and he wants to really be a Met. And it's like a slam dunk that he's going to be a Met. And then there's some reports that is like he really likes the Dodgers and it's a slam dunk that he wants to be a Dodger and he wants to play on the West Coast. So like none of the reports are really adding up in terms of what Yamamoto wants. But I think the Mariners are pretty interested in him. So and that's going to be that because he's 25 years old and he's arguably the second best free agent on the market in general outside of Ohtani. He's just that talented. And we're talking about a market that has guys like Sonny Gray and Blake Snell and had Aaron Nola before he re-signed with the Phillies. I think Yamamoto has the potential to be better than those guys. I think he's a legit number 2 that could look like an ace at times. And that's probably going to cost you $200 million over 6-7 years. So will they be willing to spend that kind of money on a completely? I mean, I know he's proven over in Japan, but you haven't seen it at the major league level. So are you willing to spend that kind of money in years on that kind of player on that kind of profile. I don't know, but I think they do have a lot of interest in him. Just like they did with Kodai Senga as well. Trying to think though. Lourdes Gurriel Jr. is someone that I mentioned. Doesn't strike out. He walks. The Mariners have obviously made it pretty clear that they want to limit the strikeouts. I'm a little bit worried about them doing that in terms of from an overcorrection standpoint, where they trade Gino and they literally just say no more strikeouts except for the guys that they literally cannot live without, like Cal and Julio. So I'm a little concerned about that, but yeah, I think Gurriel's a good fit in terms of limiting the strikeouts and just kind of balancing out their roster. But I'm really intrigued, because we haven't seen this yet. I don't know when this is coming out, but it's November 21st, and we haven't seen a position player of any sort of note really sign. So because of how bad the market is, are guys going to get overpaid? Are they still going to get paid properly? Like with Teo, right? Teo, for example. Teo's coming off of a bad year. He's not a good defender. He's, in his 30s now, and this could just be the cliff for him, right? But could he still get $18 million a year over 3 years just because he's, by circumstance, one of the 7 best hitters still in the market? Maybe. So that's really what I'm interested to see. And then, if that's the case, guys like Gurriel might start pushing $20 million a year, and I don't know if the Mariners want to do that for someone of his caliber, which is fringe all-star. So there's options. I think though that the biggest bat they get this offseason is going to be via trade. And I think they're going to sign a starting pitcher. And when they sign a starting pitcher, it might not make sense at the time. They might have, they might still have Miller or Wu at the time. And a lot of fans are going to go what are they doing? We need hitters. Why are they trading for pitching? But I think the plan would ultimately be then at that point to pivot and trade one of the young pitchers, or maybe Logan Gilbert's a dark horse trade candidate. I don't think they're going to deal him. I think if they deal one of the starters, it's going to be Miller and Wu, but you never know. So yeah, I'm really intrigued to see how creative Dipoto and Hollander get here, especially if they fall short in the Ohtani sweepstakes, I think we all kind of expect them to.
Okay, and then just one final question. As we head into 2024, with the AL West really stacked up here between the Astros and the Rangers, maybe you can throw the Mariners in there if they make the right moves. What do you see happening in the division this year? You can also use this question to say whatever you would like about the Angels.
The Angels are getting what they deserve. I'll just say that, and I'll leave it at that. God, those pathetic sons of guns. All right, so the division right now, I don't know, man. It's going to be very dependent on what happens this offseason. Because I think that the Rangers could make another splash. I mean, the thing that I'm having a ton of anxiety about is him signing is Ohtani signing with the Rangers. I think that's actually a real possibility. So yeah, I wouldn't want that to happen, because at that point, I don't know if there's anything you can do if you're the Mariners to at least in terms of acquisitions to match that. The Astros, I think I think we're finally starting to see kind of the end of their reign. I know still a lot of guys had really good years there, but their pitching is not in a good spot. The thing that we need to keep in mind about these teams, as they currently stand, they weren't far off from one another. I mean, the Astros won the division. The Rangers are the World Series champs, and the Mariners finished literally just 2 games behind those guys. If a couple things go right over the course of the season that didn't, the Rangers might not even be in the playoffs, let alone win the World Series. So, I think we should look at it from that perspective. And also, I think the Mariners have an advantage, a very important advantage over those 2 teams, and that's on the pitching front. Again, the Astros pitching is shaky. Their rotation is shaky. The Rangers obviously have their own pitching woes, and I think if they don't get Ohtani, that's probably what they're going to really focus on this offseason. I think they're probably going to overpay for Josh Hader. I don't believe in giving any reliever, $15 to $20 million a year, especially with the way that the Mariners have been able to develop, relievers. But I think they're probably going to do something like that. I still don't think it'll be enough though, because the Mariners just have, even if they just run it back with the rotation that they have right now, they have the best rotation in the division, and one of, if not the best rotations in the game. And I think that would only, get significantly better if they did sign someone like Yamamoto, or they did go out and get Blake Snell or Sonny Gray or someone like that. So the Mariners, I don't see any situation here or any path to the Rangers or the Astros establishing a pitching staff across the board that's better than the Mariners come opening day. So the Mariners already have that advantage. It's just that they need to close the gap offensively a little bit. They really do. Now, they're not going to build a world-beating offense like the Rangers this year, and I don't even think the Rangers offense is going to be able to repeat what it was able to do this year. They had a lot of guys that performed well above expectations this year, and that I'm very surprised that lost for a full season for them, and that was ultimately what carried them to a World Series title. I don't think that continues. I still think that they're going to be very good. I just don't think that they're going to hit on that kind of level. And then the Astros, I mean, Altuve's getting older. I know he had a great year, but he's getting older. He's been getting hurt more lately. Jordan's been dealing with some injuries over the last calendar year. Is Bregman eventually going to fall off? Jeremy Pena took a big step back this year. They had a lot of kind of negative things happen. It's pretty remarkable that they were still able to win 90 games, but I think they really, really need to reassess their roster. Because I don't think right now, as they're currently constructed, I don't know if they're very savvy. They're veteran savvy. They're going to be able to win a lot of ball games just on that, and like the talent that they have with Jordan, Kyle Tucker, and all those guys. But I don't know if they're really built for October, and I think we kind of saw that in their series with the Astros at times, or with the Rangers at times, kind of crop up. So, yeah, I don't feel too bad about the division right now. I think the Mariners are in a decent enough spot. It's just they really, really need to get better offensively. They need to build an offense that takes advantage of opportunities more often, that puts the ball in play more often, and keeps the game in motion more often. And if they do that, even if the moves aren't going to wow fans, I think if they just beef up the supporting cast that they have, to kind of, uplift Julio and JP and Cal, and not put all the pressure on them, then I think they're in a good spot to do some damage, especially with that pitching staff.
All right, thank you, Ty. That we've gone way over time, but thank you. That was Dane Gonzalez. You can find him on Twitter at Dane Gonzalez, DaneGnzlz, and you can listen to him on Locked On Mariners, Seattle Overload, and Control the Zone. All that information will be in the description as well. Ty, thanks for coming on and sharing your insight.
Thanks so much, boys. Appreciate it.
And that is the end of this episode. Thank you so much for listening. And of course, a special shout out to Dane Gonzalez for joining us on this week's episode. Make sure that you subscribe, because we have episodes coming out every single week wherever you listen to podcasts, including our normal episode coming out this Friday, November 24th at the usual time. You can visit our website, cctalks.com, to find anything you need to know about the show, and call us with questions, 360-389-2630. Again, that's 360-389-2630. And follow us on Twitter at CC Talks Podcast, and follow Charlie at CC Talks Charlie. For our producer Morris, production designer Zach, sound designer Drake, Dane Gonzalez, and of course Charlie, I'm Colin. Thanks for listening. We'll see you on Friday.